I'm Scott Loveridge. I'm director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. And if folks could mute their microphones, I'm getting a little echo here. Welcome to the seminar series we're hosting here this fall. This is the first of our series. Please take a look at our website for some of the future ones. It's great to be hosting this one today here with Mary Emery leading this group. Mary is department chair in the Department of Sociology at South Dakota State University, but she's worked with the center in a number of capacities throughout the years. When the center was located at Iowa State, she was associate director and led many initiatives, including around the areas of community capitals and working with Native American populations. And so it's really a treat to have Mary back here with us today, albeit briefly, to talk about this topic, and I'll let her then introduce her colleagues.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm going to just talk a little bit about how we came to be in this session with you today, and then turn it over to the rest of our presenters. We have a small group of folks that were originally funded by the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development to get together and to look at what we can learn from each other about community change initiatives. And there is one of the archived webinars that Scott mentioned is actually talks about what we learned from the community change project. But after looking at what we can learn about what is working in different places with community change, we started to ask some questions about how do we know that we're really making a difference and what's really going on in these circumstances. And we found that there are a lot of people that have interest in this question, and so we wanted to put together some examples of how people are starting to work with that question of how do you really measure change in community change initiatives. But we think it's particularly important to be looking at this because there's been a lot of investment in community change initiatives, both within foundations, within extension, and within state and local governments as well. So we want to know, do these initiatives really make a difference? How do we know we know? And we want to talk a little bit about what makes measuring community change a difficult task, to say the very least. And we have some really great presenters here to talk about their experiences. First, Mylan Wall, co-director of the Heartland Center for Leadership Development, we'll be talking a little bit about how they're working with communities on helping them build capacity to measure community change. He will be followed by Liz Weaver, who is a member of the evaluation team for the Tamarack Project in Canada, which has been looking at reducing poverty in several Canadian areas. And then finally, Tom Kelly, who is the head evaluator for the Annie E. Casey Foundation, will talk about what they've learned from their work with community change initiatives in the last 10 years, actually. So without too much more ado, let me turn it over to Mylan, and he can start the presentations.
Now Mylan needs to unmute his mic, so don't forget to unmute.
Okay, Scott, how's that working? Scott, are we on?
We're hearing you fine, Mylan. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Mary, for the introduction, for the chance to participate in today's session. What I'm going to be talking about is something that we call the hierarchy of community impacts, which, as Mary said, we developed here at the Heartland Center as a way to work with communities that we're partnering on to help them develop change strategies, to set priorities for positive change in their communities, and to figure out ways from the very start to measure change impacts. This hierarchy is sort of conceptualized by the bullets that are on the screen now. You know, why another evaluation model? We have lots of evaluation models around, and this one we really put together as a way to help community leaders talk about and measure community change from the very beginning of a change process. So it's really designed for community leaders. It's designed in a way that community leaders can self-administer this approach. We're trying to minimize scientific jargon as much as possible. One of our experiences here at the Heartland Center with evaluation models and community leaders is that if they seem overly complex or academic, folks sort of throw up their arms in frustration and say, well, I can't deal with all that stuff. Let's help me figure out a way to simplify this so I understand it, so I can share it with my community colleagues. We also want to come up with something that was easy for community leaders to use. And so this conceptual framework is designed in a way that community leaders can easily put it into practice. We also wanted something that doesn't require a huge amount of time, but that's relatively simple and straightforward. And then probably the chief among the considerations we had in mind was to allow for assessment of impacts from the very get-go of a project implementation. One of the things that we believe frustrates community leaders about evaluation is that stakeholders, whether those stakeholders be the town council or the county board of supervisors or a distant funder, are always interested in numbers, and yet oftentimes we tend to think that it takes a considerable period of time to get to the kind of numbers that really measure something significant. So we try to come up with a way to help community leaders do this from the very start. So here in a graphic format is a hierarchy. Starts out with activities, and I'll spend a few minutes momentarily walking up this hierarchy and explaining what we mean by these with an example out of our work in leadership development. So we go up the hierarchy from activities to outputs to what we call commitments to outcomes, and then finally and most significantly in terms of systems change to indicators of systemic change. So that's the graphic, and let me walk through the explanations with you real quickly, and then I'll see if somebody has a question. So again, this is taken from a leadership development program example. A lot of our work revolves around helping communities start and implement leadership programs. So at the activities level, at the simplest level, it's, for example, has a program been created? Very simple, straightforward. We started a program. This is what the program looks like. This is how people are engaged in the program. These are the number of people who signed up for the program. We meet this many times over this period of time. For how long? Very, very simple from the very beginning of a program engagement. This provides a way for a local leader to say to the local funding agency or funding agencies, we got our program off the ground. We have 20 people engaged. Their age ranges are this, that, and the other, and so forth. Then as we move up that pyramid, we go to something we call outputs. What is the program producing is basically how we defined output. So an example is are participants attending? What's the average participation per session? An output might be a responses to a workshop. If it's a series of workshops, responses to each workshop as you go through it, with questions similar to the ones that Scott will be putting up today at the end of this webinar delivered workshop, just to say, you know, take a quick snapshot of participants' satisfaction from session to session. Again, trying to be real simple so that the community leader can go to the county board or the town council or the chamber of commerce or the economic development authority, whomever, and say, hey, this is the kind of average attendance we're getting, and here's what participants are saying about their satisfaction with what we're working through with them in the leadership program. The next level is what we call commitments. So here we're saying, so what are the folks who go through the program and complete the program? What do they say about what they're intending to do based upon what they learn? Many leadership development programs, as an example, will ask participants to make a public commitment to what they intend to do. I helped Community Nebraska, David City, Nebraska, start a leadership program a couple years back, and one of the things that the participants did on graduation day was to write their commitment on a 3x5 card. They got up in front of all of their classmates, read what was on the card, and then threw it in a hat that was placed on the table in front of them. So it was a public expression of what they intended to do. And examples were, I expect to do more volunteering in my community. I expect to be more active in my Lions Club. Someday I'd like to run for public office. Those were the kinds of things that folks said they intended to do. And then another version of measurement would be to track alumni of the program and find out whether they really acted on their commitments. Did they do what they said they were going to do? And then we move up the hierarchy one more step to outcomes. What community improvements have resulted? So can we look across the community and see that there are actual community improvements? Is the Lions Club making a greater contribution to community betterment? As an example, are more people running for public office, and so forth? And then finally, at the very top of that pyramid are what we call indicators of systemic change. And these are the long-term impacts. For example, has the pool of people engaged in community development, is that different today than it was? Is it more diversified? Are there younger faces, people of color, new faces? Can we take a look at the folks that are engaged in leadership and say, yeah, there's been a difference, and this difference we can tell by looking. Eventually, again, we hope we can tell by systemic changes in how the community goes about conducting change strategies. So in a nutshell, that is the hierarchy and how we explain it, how it's conceptualized, and I'll stop there, Scott, and see how you want to proceed with, maybe you just want to go through all of the presentations and see if people want to put up a question in the chat box or whatever, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, well, I'll ask a quick one here. One of the, we've been looking at this from the extension side of the house here in the north central region, and and the questions of you know, we're sort of in many ways we're sort of put head to head with other types of community and economic development programs in the extension programming that happens in the land grant system. What about an indicator like jobs and job creation? Have you thought about how a leadership development program could translate into systemic change along those lines, and how to measure that, because it's such a long-term process?
Sure, sure. Well, yeah. One of the communities that we've been working with now through the hometown competitiveness framework, we've been working with them for a little over, I think, 8 years. And we started with them by helping them develop a leadership program. What we see in recent data that's related to wealth creation is that per capita income in this community has significantly increased. So we're looking at measurable indicators of systemic change that forecast or actually document changes in family income. And I wouldn't say that that's totally a product of the leadership program, Scott, because this community set out 3 significant priorities from the get-go. One of them was to strengthen leadership, but others were to work with locally owned businesses to help them figure out ways to grow or expand. And then a third major goal was to help businesses go through ownership transition as previous owners entering retirement age. So there was a kind of a purposeful integration of leadership development with economic development in that community. But to answer your question, yeah, we can see more jobs and better jobs in that community. That has happened since they started down this road. Does that answer your question, Scott?
Okay, thanks. Very good. I think maybe we just go on with the next presenter. I think that's
me.
I think that's Liz. Yep.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm going to talk to you today about what we've been learning through our Vibrant Communities Initiative, which is an initiative that works across Canada with 13 cities, and we have one goal, which is really the reduction of poverty, and how we do this is in a kind of cross-community, cross-sectoral kind of way, and so I'll talk a little bit about it. One of the key premises behind this initiative is really to understand the nature of poverty, and our Vibrant Community Partners really look at poverty as a complex kind of issue where there's no one single cause or no one single solution, and that it really, in order to be able to attack the issue of poverty, you really do need to have all orders of government working together and working in collaboration with the different sectors that you can find in your communities, including local government, business, the voluntary sector or the NGO sector, and also with people who have the lived experience of poverty sitting at the tables. So Vibrant Communities is we're coming to the close of it, but it was a 10-year experiment designed to address the complex realities of poverty through local level action. And so we were guided by our theory of change, and our local community partners really bought into the 5 principles and participated in the design of that. Our communities really crossed across Canada, and you can see here the 13 communities that have been involved with Vibrant Communities. Some of them started and stopped, and others began. We had a group of 6 that began with us early, and then another group of 6 that we called Trail Builders that came along with us at the next stage. Our approach basically, we call it the 5 puzzle pieces approach. At the very center, we ask communities to really understand the nature of poverty in their community. And so this approach, I think, lends itself a lot to any kind of community change effort that's dealing with a complex issue. So at the center of the complex issue is the issue. And, you know, when you're bringing a cross-sectoral collaborative table together, all of your conceptions about the issue, whether it's poverty or healthy communities or economic development or neighborhood revitalization, each of you comes at the issue from a different perspective and a different lens. And so one of the very first tasks is to get kind of some agreement and understanding of what that complex issue is. And what we asked our communities to do was to engage in a poverty matrix where they really looked at the demographic impacts of poverty on the community, and then also to engage in a dialogue about what poverty meant to them as leaders engaged in this work. The second puzzle piece is really, as I mentioned, the multi-sector collaboration. What's critical to this collaboration is that the voice of individuals with the lived experience of poverty is at the table, and along with business, government, and voluntary sector. It's that mix of voices that we believe really gives us some significant leverage and some significant change. The third puzzle piece is really to look at poverty or whatever issue from not just a single source solution, but really try to look at the issue from a comprehensive lens. And then what type of activities will you undertake when you're looking at the issue comprehensively? The fourth puzzle piece is really to look at the assets that already exist in the community and how they can be leveraged to really drive forward the community change effort. And then the fifth puzzle piece is really looking at taking on a learning and change perspective. So testing things, both having some success and also failing, but always learning from what you're doing. So it's a learning and doing kind of orientation. Because we had 13 communities engaged in this work and we wanted to understand the on-the-ground change that was happening for individuals and households, we determined that we needed a framework where we could monitor this change. And after much discussion, the Sustainable Livelihoods Assets Pentagon approach really helped us understand the differences that these community change efforts were making in the lives of individuals and their families living in poverty, and the degree to which we were improving assets, whether it's physical, personal, financial, human, or social assets for individuals living in poverty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But having when you're working with 13 very diverse communities, having a single framework really was quite a useful exercise for us and really helped us kind of understand how the change was happening at both the community level, but how it was also happening at the national level. We, like Mylan talked about in terms of his hierarchy of outcomes, we actually looked at 4 levels of community change or community outcomes and asked our vibrant community partners to report on these twice a year. One was on decreased poverty, the second level was on increased community engagement, the third on increased community capacity, and then policy and systems level change. These are the results that we reported in June of 2010. Now, we've had our partners report their changes since then, and our numbers, if you look at the poverty reducing benefits, I just took this slide from our evaluation report, but we're now up to over 195,000 households and individuals that have benefited. So it's quite a significant amount of change that has happened across the communities. Some of the lessons, we've just completed a 8-year retrospective of these 13 communities, and some of the lessons that we learned when you actually bring people together and work collaboratively, we learned that you can raise the profile of poverty, that you can build a constituency of change, which includes both some of the traditional voices that would be engaged in this work, but a lot of the non-traditional voices. It really does encourage new collaborative ways of working, and that we begin to see some of that higher level systems change or system shifting that we believe will lead to the higher scale change for poverty reduction, but it has to really begin at the local level. But you also have to think about how the programs that you're doing to shift individual and household assets, how that can be transformative for policy and systems change. Some of the success factors that we determined with our 13 partners was that you need to have influential and credible conveners at the local community level. Those influential and credible conveners really are critical in the first stage of development in terms of bringing people to the table and getting them engaged in the work. A cross-sector connected leadership table, one that is working not only around the table, but is connected into other networks in the community and can bring those other networks in to help leverage and push poverty reduction efforts, is also a critical success factor. A challenging community aspiration. Our partners each developed a theory of change or framework for change approach, and many of them had challenging community aspirations. In St. John, New Brunswick, for example, they wanted to reduce poverty by 50% within 5 years, and they've actually made significant strides towards that. In Hamilton, the aspiration is to make Hamilton the best place to raise a child. So those challenging community aspirations are really a way of gaining momentum and focus on the poverty reduction efforts, but also pushing the work forward and reaching out beyond the collaborative table to engaging the community in a broader perspective. Clearly articulated purpose and approach. So the framework for change approach was very significant for our communities in terms of both articulating how they're going to tackle poverty, but then also communicating it beyond their collaborative roundtables. Resident mobilization, including the voices of people with the lived experience, is really critical. It really gives momentum to the work, and it also gives a sense of urgency, particularly when you're dealing with an issue like poverty. By including the voices of lived experience, they want solutions now, and that actually gives momentum for change to the collaborative roundtable. And then the final kind of critical success factor is really ensuring that you have enough research to inform the work, but not get into analysis paralysis, which can sometimes happen in these collaborative kinds of efforts. But you certainly do have to work from that strong base of research. We have an evaluation report that's available on our website, and so I've included a link here. You can learn more about vibrant communities through our website and through the Tamarack community website. There's also a ton of other resources for individuals that are engaged in collaborative work on the website, and so I invite you to go there and learn a little bit more. We are also entering into phase 2 of our evaluation, which should be out probably November or December of this year, where we're looking at what kinds of national supports are really required to help this kind of community change effort become very successful. And so that will be posted on our website in November or December of this year. So I'm done.
Thanks, Liz. This is Scott Loveridge again. One thing that really struck me as incredibly powerful is, and you've got it sort of on the cover of your evaluation report. So I was going to go back to the earlier slide, but you've got pieces of it here, and that's this the total impacts that you're able to report. So I guess 2 questions on that is, first, how did you get people to tell you that this is going on? And secondly, has the government of Canada noticed? Are you taking this forward and telling this story to policymakers?
Absolutely. So the Vibrant Community Partners, we, during our process, negotiated back and forth with our partners on the reporting criteria, and we came up with the criteria that measured those 4 levels of change, and set up a framework for them to report on twice a year. And they've been pretty good at giving us the reports, and we have an evaluator that we work with who checks back with them if he doesn't quite understand, and he's been with us for the process overall. So he checks back if he's not sure about what a community is reporting, or if there are some challenges. And then we also report back to the communities once they've given us their results. We report the collective results back to them as a check-in through our conveners. Our Vibrant Community conveners meet bi-monthly by teleconference, and so we'll have questions about the results that we've seen or some of the trends that we're noticing, and we invite them to give us their perspectives and their dialogue. So users are very much engaged in both the development of the questions, the contribution of the data, and then their perspectives on the results that we're seeing. With this evaluation report, we've taken a pretty active dissemination strategy. So not only have we disseminated it back to our Vibrant partners, but we've also, and we've gone into each of our Vibrant partner communities and talked about the results as a whole, and also their contribution, that particular community's contributions to the results. We've engaged with national partners in presenting our results, and we are, the federal government in Canada was a funder, so they've been involved in both the design of the evaluation. They were one of our key stakeholders when we said, what kind of information would you like us to, obtain through this evaluative process? So we got them engaged in really a user way in terms of the evaluation results. And we're also working not only at the federal government level, but then there are 7 provinces and 3 territories in Canada that have poverty reduction strategies at a provincial or territorial level. And so we've also engaged with government stakeholders at the provinces and at the territorial government levels to communicate the results. So it's been pretty active dissemination.
And have they taken steps based on the information that's coming back? Are they pushing to implement this in other places, or are they wanting to fund you to do more communities, or what's been kind of the response from the dissemination efforts?
So for those provinces that have developed poverty reduction strategies, what we've noticed, even though we've worked directly with 13 cities to reduce poverty in the time that provincial governments, which has really been quite significant over the last 2 or 3 years, have been developing their own provincial strategies, we've been working with a whole bunch of other cities where collaborative tables have been emerging. Even though we have our 13, the lessons that we've learned we've shared really broadly, and has supported this movement overall. And our next phase, we're calling Cities Reducing Poverty, and we'll be expanding to what we hope is 100 cities across Canada to continue this work and to start to really understand wider scale change in these cities and communities. We know that there's, currently about, we have contact with about 60 other cities where there are collaborative roundtables with a focus on poverty, and so they're part of that new catchment group that that we'll start to reach out to in our next phase.
Okay, thanks a lot. Looks like Betsy has a question here in the chat box, if you want to take a look at that. She's kind of asking the question about passing the baton on to other community leaders. Once you've kind of got the ball rolling, how do you kind of move it on to somebody within the community to keep it going, so that you can kind of graduate a community and move on and have them continue to be successful?
That's the whole notion of collaborative governance it's been a very interesting one to observe in our the communities that we've worked with. Some of them haven't passed the baton on as elegantly as they could. The role of a fiscal sponsor or a convener is a very important role for these collaborative roundtables, because many of them exist not as their own entities, but exist as part of another organization sponsoring them. And we've typically seen the convener organizations come from the local government or the municipal government is often a convener. United Ways or community foundations have often played the role of convener, or the local social planning council. And what we've observed in terms of the collaborative governance is that that convener relationship is a critical one in terms of the structure of the entity overall. Often the conveners will remain with the roundtables and will play the role as the fiscal sponsor, but also a member of the roundtable. And it's that kind of balance between, you know, not only holding some of the decision-making criteria, but also, you know, being a member of a broader decision-making body. So it's a very interesting relationship.
Okay, thanks. So we've got some people that have raised their hands. We really don't have anything to, you got to sort of type it into the chat box if you got a question. We're not passing the audio to the participants. So if you could just put your questions in the chat box, that would be great. I think we're ready to move on to Tom now.
Hello. Okay. Hello, this is Tom Kelly from Annie E. Casey. I'm based here in Baltimore, Maryland. The Casey Foundation is a national U.S. private foundation dedicated to outcomes for America's children, mostly vulnerable children. We're a large U.S. funder that has expanded its focus that began with foster care and child welfare outcomes into the variety of community and family supports for kids, particularly a focus on some place-based neighborhood, community-level strategies as well. My presentation complements both Mylan and Liz's, and I'll point those out. We began more than 10 years ago with a place-based traditional community change initiative in 22 cities beginning in 2000, and then in 2002 focused the entire implementation on 10 cities in the U.S. located here. Within those cities, we focused specifically on about 1 to 3 neighborhoods. The geography was focused on approximately 28,000 people on average. I'll just point out an aside. We began with a hypothesis that we didn't want to get larger than 12 or 14,000 people, but communities often included adjacent neighborhoods. We specifically targeted neighborhoods with high degree of childhood poverty, so high percentages of children living below the U.S. poverty level. The questions that we asked ourselves as part of the evaluation, and I led the evaluation of the 10 sites here from Casey, was focused, so similarly as Liz concluded, with the outcomes for children and families in these neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Could we achieve them? What, in fact, those outcomes should be, and I'll just mention them in a moment. We also, though, wanted to see about the influence that these initiatives would have locally on the neighborhood's policy, their organizational systems, their relationships, whether they could attract more funding, whether there were any system or policy changes that occurred. And particularly at this end stage of the initiative, we were very interested in whether the work that was continuing on the ground would be sustained beyond Casey's funding, ending in 2011 or 2012, and also whether or not there were any ripple effects or scaling of the work that had occurred. We did have a focus on child and family level outcomes. our numbers look different from the ones that Liz just presented, but we had very similar categories of asking people to document job placements, assets being brought to families, whether it's housing or savings accounts. And my presentation here is not going to focus on those child and family level outcomes, but looking at those three remaining bullets here of, where could we look at particularly interim indicators and measures of change in these communities, the process evaluation or the implementation evaluation, and how could we in fact link it to the outcome evaluation focused on children, families, and neighborhoods. This was a big gap in a lot of our measurement plans, I'll say, at the beginning of the initiative, which we spent a lot of time looking at neighborhood level surveys, program and neighborhood level implementation data, but really struggling in the evaluation on answering these questions. What in fact had occurred in the development of the work within these 10 places. I'll just lift them all up. We did have, and this is a very high-level schematic of what the overall theory was for the initiative. It really was about connecting families and connecting these neighborhoods to economic opportunities for jobs and asset building, connecting families amongst each other, not only for social networks for supports, but also connections socially outside of the neighborhood. And also making sure that families were connected to effective services and supports that they needed when they needed. Each of those kind of outcome categories or buckets did have, I'll say, categories of change that we were looking for. Increased earnings and income, so this meant work, not just jobs with benefits, types of jobs with career potential. We did look at asset building, not only the financial asset building with savings accounts, retirement, but also things like access to financial products and services, things like insurance, car insurance. We would even look at more neighborhood level metrics on just availability of credit. Over time, this led to issues of not just redlining, which we still found in our neighborhoods, but also things like, believe it or not, starting in our 2003 survey, seeing those early warning signs of predatory mortgage lending that was going on in our neighborhoods as early as 2002. And in addition, looking at particular services and supports, not only for the family, but for the children, looking at the early childhood from sort of birth to age 8. Over time, we got better and clearer about the child outcomes and focused specifically in that healthy birth, kindergarten readiness, and third grade reading success for children. The investments from Casey really were focused on providing technical assistance, initiative implementation money, the sort of glue and mortar to run the initiative, and also some leveraged co-investments that included for us some social investments, which were endowment investments in sort of market rate activities that had a social benefit return. Our theory about how to achieve this really was about the community change portion, and what did it take to achieve putting all of this together in a way that would achieve child level outcomes in the long term. Getting to agreement on what these elements were really was the basis of the early years in the initiative. It certainly builds on many of the things mentioned in both of the previous presentations, but also what the community change field knew and had known up to this point from initiatives that had occurred in the 90s. Specifically, though, in the evaluation, we were struggling with then how and what to measure in this section. And we began with my lead evaluator, Mary Aschatz from Westat, using Bev Parsons' stages of systemic change. We were struck by this for a few reasons. First was this developmental approach, really thinking about the changes that a community will go through in order to change what she called old systems, sort of business as usual, into a making sure that a new way of working together becomes not only relevant but a dominant way of working right through the development of these 6 stages. She also named elements of change that we felt had a lot of relevance and were very complementary to some of the definitions that were already being surfaced by our local sites. And again, these are now at this point 10 sites across the U.S. implementing similar categories of work, but not necessarily implementing the same strategies. So we used BEV's stages of systemic change and essentially adapted it slightly for ourselves and our initiative. We did begin with 6 stages, just as she had. We did work in a participatory manner with all of our sites to get some agreement that this was the right way to work, get some agreement on what these stages meant, and perhaps what the elements that we could put in these stages would be. One of the first things they pushed back on, actually, was this issue of sustainability not only being, in this case, in a matrix or column, but a lot of attention on the issue of sustainability being kind of a row or an element, meaning that each of these elements had to think about sustainability across the entire developmental spectrum. In addition, we spent time really thinking about what work was going on for each of these. These are really the activities that the initiative spent the most time on, also spent the most money on, and wanting to figure out if we could get agreement across 10 cities into essentially the use of a kind of developmental framework, as well as the elements that were going into their work. And this does represent a kind of common frame across our 10 cities. What it also enabled us to do, however, was to spend the time with each site individually to decide what, for example, a partnership with Key Institution would look like in this particular city. What we did not want to do from the cross-site evaluation was come up with some generic indicators that were perhaps not relevant. So for example, in a community where the United Way and or Community Foundation were quite strong and instrumental in implementing service and system changes, we wanted to make sure that then that was reflected in a partnership with a Key Institution. But yet in another city, if the United Way wasn't as important, just including a sort of United Way checklist would not really represent the true change that was going on in the community. So again, we shared a kind of sense of developmental stage. We shared a definition of elements. We worked individually with the sites to determine their individual indicators that would show progress across this. The process actually, we then engaged annually. I'm sorry if that keeps blinking. That should not have occurred annually with each site. It generally was a 1 to 2 day event where all the partners were convened together. My lead evaluators would facilitate the meeting. We did not show the matrix as a scoring sheet to folks. This was actually an engaged discussion over 2 days around really prompting about questions about their work, and the evaluator was then using the discussion and the evidence that people would raise, the documented examples that would represent progress. The evaluator was responsible for sort of capturing it and feeding it back to the group in a document after the fact that did in fact use the matrix and use the scoring. Over time, we developed a kind of, the best way I would say it is a high, medium, low for each stage. So you could see a sort of, when you're just entering a stage, sort of in the middle, and as you get it more advanced, in essence, that then created a 3 points times 5 stages. So we had a 15-point matrix. I don't think the points were necessarily important, but it was a good way for people to track their own progress. As the cross-site evaluator, I was less worried about comparing one city to another, and it was more important for me for community to see its own progress against its own baseline. Each element had its own row, so to speak, and so we were this is just an example of one element where there could be then some very specific examples and types of events or activities that would demonstrate that they had moved from one stage to another. This process was done in every site annually. I will say that we had 2 sites who were, I'll say, my best examples where this process of self-assessment with the facilitation of an evaluator actually helped them in their work, almost in a strategic planning sense, that they actually chose to use this method for organizing all of their work. So they literally would have a 1 to 2 day session just on workforce strategies and a 1 day session on early childhood strategies to really help everyone and all the partners see their role in the work, understand where they had been and what the baseline had been. Over time, the process really did do several things, certainly for me in the cross-site evaluation, but also for the sites. The first was we were able to use a common framework across sites. We could at least talk about the work of the sites, the messy, different, and idiosyncratic change work that was going on these sites, but we were able to use some definitions and categories that were common. We yet also were able to really give folks individualized indicators of the work locally where they were most relevant. It was really important for them to understand their own change and not worry about a cross-site evaluator who was necessarily ranking or scoring sites without some local context being specified. We used the word evidence, but in this case it was a prompt for sites to really name the reasons why they felt they were making progress with some really clear documented examples. This participatory reflection process was both a participatory in its evaluation in that we did work with them to set up the scoring system and actually talk about the indicators, but in also just the process of their participation in their own self-assessment was a big step in getting them to understand particularly the big picture. Another thing that had happened was this really was an intervention in that some of the sites who had perhaps less intensive relationships with certain partners, the process of actually going through a self-assessment like this enabled them to bring a more common understanding of the work across a variety of partners and players locally. We'll be specifically writing up, and this draft is now done and we'll be finishing a kind of report not only on what we learned about the capacities that were built within the sites, but the process of how we went about it. My lead evaluator, again, Mary Eschetz, is finishing that now. That will be available on Casey's website in our knowledge management system as well. More importantly, I've just felt that I've now used this process of assessing, particularly when there's differences in implementation, but a shared understanding of the staging of developmental work for a variety of some initiatives that are getting going. It's been a big plus for me to strengthen our process or implementation evaluation and not leave it solely in the kind of mind and purview of the evaluator, but really get the implementation understood much better by those on the ground who are implementing. I'll stop there and for any questions and leave some room as well.
Well, great, thanks, Tom. If anybody's got a question, please use the chat box to put your question in there. We are coming a little bit close to the end of the hour here, so timing is good. While folks are thinking about that and typing, just a couple of questions that I had. I'm intrigued by the individualized indicators that you're using. Are they so I understand, it makes sense if collaborations are already well developed, then obviously you don't need to be pushing on that and maybe don't count it as an indicator. But is there enough similarity across these things when you're looking at the different communities you're working with to be able to aggregate so that maybe community A approaches something in one way with the same goal as community B, which is approaching it in a different way, but the outcome is the same? Can you, are the outcomes similar enough across communities that you can begin to tell the story of the total impact of what you're doing.
And I'll, Scott, your first part of your question actually is interesting because in many cases coming up with individualized local indicators was important for a few reasons. I think the first was the recognition that, in fact, as you said, there were some things already in place. You know, some sites were just beginning perhaps with a more advanced collaborations already in place, with perhaps more advanced data infrastructure in place. And so recognizing that people were not starting at the same starting line or baseline. The second thing which was important was the recognition that even though it was achieved, it didn't necessarily mean that it would stick around. So it forced a lot of the sites to consider these indicators as also things to watch and pay attention to. Because in a 10-year initiative, many of the sites also experienced that not everything was a linear progression, but in fact, advances perhaps in developing a strong workforce strategy might mean they lost some connection to some other partners or players along the way. So there was this recognition that not everything was just incremental and stayed that way. So if you made it to an 8 or a 9, you stayed that way, but that things could slip. And so keeping track of the slippage where things perhaps were achieved and lost, a key partnership was gained, but there was a change in leadership. So I think that, in addition, was important. Now, the similarities across sites, I'm looking at the data that we have so far. There perhaps are two things. Not everything was highly predictive in that, let's say, a strong collaborative body in one community was able to achieve as much or more as perhaps a policy or system level change in another community that perhaps wasn't very collaborative in its nature. So in terms of volume and absolute numbers, not always. However, we are seeing patterns of similarity around things which are sustaining beyond the KC investments and may in fact be scaling or replicated beyond the KC investments. So we are seeing some similarities in the categories around scale and sustainability, more so than I would say that we're seeing some similarities around whether they achieve the same level or volume of outcome indicators.
Okay, thanks. I put up the summary evaluation, so just, you know, as you're thinking about this, please click all that apply there. I'll go ahead and ask another question to Tom, and maybe the other presenters can chime in as well if you've got perspectives on this. You know, it seemed to me that you know, one of the things that's really you know, wonderful if you're coming from a foundation perspective is the ability to take maybe a little bit longer view than perhaps a political leader or some other official, and so, you know, but that longer term perspective is quite healthy, but it seems like there's maybe less of it out there than there had been, you know, 10 or 15 years ago in society. And you know, do you encounter this sort of impatience for results as you're doing your work, and how do you counter that and get people to think a little bit longer term in what they're doing?
I didn't include in this presentation, I was focusing specifically on the implementation aspect of the evaluation, but we did struggle even with a 10-year commitment from our board of trustees as well as our staff, keeping people's attention and keeping people's interest. And one of those ways was to document impacts on children and families along the way, but do it carefully. And we did have quarterly dashboards from sites that summarize, just as Liz pointed out, some things like job placements or kindergarten readiness scores. Not everything would change every quarter, but we were able to show updates over time. But we would also try to lift up for folks that the change at the neighborhood level or the population level would move more slowly. And so keep people's attention on the both levels of change, both at the families that were being directly touched, as well as all the families in the neighborhood, and showing that those necessarily don't happen on the same timetable. Also, I think putting in perspective the comparison to other like neighborhoods, simply to say that what was going on contextually or what's going on changed overall, and to not raise too many expectations that even in 10 years you could see a radical shift in a population's level of poverty.
Great. Any of the other presenters have a perspective on that, of how to encourage a little bit longer term planning horizon? Some good points there about kind of some goodies along the way and comparisons.
Yeah, Scott, this is Mylan. Well, real quickly, the hierarchy that I talked about earlier was conceptualized as a way to give people some things to measure early, so that those concrete thinkers that we work with all the time would have something to point to, while those who have a greater degree of patience about the longer horizon would have something further down the road that would be the indicators of systemic change. So we were trying to, I guess, provide a balance between the short-term or immediate and the long-term and the more systemic.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a good set of principles to lay out there, and I think all of you have done a great job of sharing some ideas on how to do this kind of work and keep people motivated. We are a little bit past our witching hour here, so we're going to close, but if folks could please click the evaluations, just everything that applies, and then we'll get that feedback over to the presenters. Thanks everybody for being on today, and to our presenters. I'm going to turn off the recording now.